Born under the omen of a shattered moon, Alara grew up hearing whispers that her fate would either save a kingdom or destroy it. Shunned by her own pack and carrying a mysterious mark she didn't understand, she arrived at the Moon Festival hopping for one normal night. There, she found herself drawn to the Alpha King's charming younger brother and shamelessly flirted with him, until a deep voice whispered in her ear, "You keep choosing the wrong brother." When she turned around, the real Alpha King was standing behind her, staring at her as if he had known her all along. They called her the Ghost of the Weaver's Quarter. For 23 years, Alara Voss had lived beneath notice. She woke before the sun did, bent over her loom while the rest of Valor was still dreaming, and she went to bed long after the candles in the noble houses had burned themselves out. She was nobody. She had no wolf, no rank, no family name that carried any weight in this city. She was just the quiet girl with thread-stained fingers and a talent that everyone used and nobody celebrated. The wolves who ruled Valor did not see her. Not really. She moved through the market like water around stone, always stepping aside, always dropping her eyes when someone important passed. She had learned early that invisibility was its own kind of armor. If they did not see you, they could not use you. If they did not know your name, they could not summon you. So she kept her head down and her hands busy and her dreams small enough to fit inside the four walls of her workshop. But the Moon Festival only came once a year. And this year, something inside Alara had simply refused to stay home. She could not explain it, not even to herself. She had stood in front of her small cracked mirror that evening, holding the one dress she owned that was not stained with dye or fraying at the hem, and she had made a decision that felt almost reckless. One night. She was going to give herself one single night where she was not the weaver, not the ghost, not the invisible girl who everyone looked through like glass. Just one night of being a person who existed. She pinned her dark hair up the way she had seen noblewomen do it, the soft curls she usually hid tucked away now framing her face like she had planned them there. She did not have jewelry or silk or any of the beautiful things that the high-ranking wolves would be wearing tonight. But she had the dress, deep green like pine needles after rain, and she had her chin lifted just a little higher than usual, and she decided that would have to be enough. The streets of Valor were already alive by the time she stepped outside. The Moon Festival transformed this city in a way that nothing else could. Lanterns hung from every window and door frame, gold and silver and pale white, swaying gently in the warm evening breeze. The cobblestones that usually smelled of horse and mud and the metallic sharpness of trade had been scrubbed clean, and now the air carried the sweetness of roasted spiced nuts and honeyed wine being sold from carts along the main road. Children ran between the legs of adults, laughing at nothing and everything. Music came from 3 different directions at once, strings and pipes, and the low, steady beat of a drum that Alara felt in her chest more than she heard with her ears. She walked slowly, letting it all soak into her. She touched the petals of a flower wreath hanging from a baker's door. She stopped to watch 2 elderly wolves spin each other in a clumsy, joyful dance near a fountain, both of them laughing so hard they could barely stay upright. She bought a small paper cone of those roasted nuts with the last coin she had tucked into her pocket, and she ate them one by one, savoring each one because they were warm and sweet and real, and she was here, actually here, not watching from behind a window. The festival square opened up ahead of her like a held breath finally released. It was enormous. The stone plaza at the heart of Valor had been filled with people from every part of the city, and torches burned in tall iron stands all around the edges, casting everything in a trembling amber glow. At the center, a great bonfire rose toward the night sky, its flames licking the darkness above, and around it the city moved and laughed and pressed close to one another the way people do when they are happy and do not want the feeling to end. Alara stood at the edge of it and just breathed. This was what she had wanted, not the conversation or the dancing or even the warmth of the fire. Just this, the feeling of being inside something larger than her own 4 walls, the feeling of belonging even if it was borrowed for just one night. She was so busy watching everything that she almost did not notice him. He was standing near one of the tall iron torch stands, a little apart from the loudest part of the crowd, and he was watching the fire with a small smile on his face like it had said something privately amusing to him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled just slightly at the ends like he had not bothered to tame it for the evening, and his clothes were fine without being stiff. No heavy ceremonial coat, no rank markings gleaming on his chest. He looked in this moment almost ordinary. Almost. There was something in the way he held himself, easy and loose and completely unbothered, that told Alara he had never once in his life had to make himself smaller for anyone. He was the kind of beautiful that people wrote terrible poetry about, the kind that made you aware of your own hands and whether you were standing correctly. Alara looked away immediately, then looked back. He caught her, not in a cruel way, not in the way the high-ranking wolves sometimes caught her starring, that slow, cold assessment that made her feel like something to be priced and dismissed. He caught her the way someone does when they are pleasantly surprised, and the corner of his mouth lifted just a little more, and he tilted his head the smallest amount, and Alara felt her heart do something it had absolutely no business doing. She thought about turning around and going home. She thought about the four walls and the loom and the 23 years of being careful, being quiet, being nobody. She walked toward him instead. "You look like you are trying to decide whether the fire is worth the crowd," she said, stopping beside him, her eyes on the bonfire and not on his face, because if she looked directly at him, she was going to lose her nerve entirely. She heard the warmth in his voice before she registered the actual words. "And you look like you are trying to decide whether tonight was worth leaving the house for." She turned then because that was too specific not to look at him for. He was watching her with open, easy curiosity, no performance in it, and up close he was even worse for her composure, dark eyes that caught the firelight and held it. "Is it that obvious?" she asked. Only to someone who was thinking the same thing an hour ago. She laughed. It came out before she could stop it, short and genuine, and something in his expression shifted like that laugh had pleased him in a way he had not expected. They talked. She did not know for how long. It felt like minutes, and it felt like the whole night compressed into something bright and too fast. He asked her what she did, and she told him she was a weaver, and instead of the polite disinterest she was used to, he asked her what she made, and then he asked what her favorite thing to make was, and nobody had ever asked her that before. She told him about a particular piece she had woven once, a deep blue panel with gold thread worked through it that had taken her 3 weeks, and how she had cried a little when she sold it because she had not wanted to let it go. He listened to all of it like it mattered. She had been reaching for him, she realized later, leaning in by degrees the way a plant leans towards sunlight without meaning to, without deciding to. The noise of the festival had become background. The crowd had blurred. There was just this man and the warmth of the fire and the feeling, the dangerous, lovely feeling, that maybe tonight could be something real. She said something low, something bold, something that she would have never in 23 years of careful invisibility allowed herself to say to anyone. An invitation, small and daring and hers. The shadow came from nowhere. It did not arrive loudly. There was no dramatic movement, no shout. Just a presence, a sudden shift in the air around them, the way a room changes when a door opens somewhere and the temperature drops by 2 degrees. The warmth that had been sitting between her and this man evaporated completely. She felt it on the back of her neck first. Then a hand, not grabbing, not rough, just firm and absolute, rested on her shoulder and turned her by degrees. And she turned because something in her body understood before her mind did that she did not have a choice. The man looking down at her was not the same man she had been talking to. Same dark hair, same strong jaw, same height, similar enough that in the firelight you might mistake one for the other if you were not paying close attention. But this man's eyes were silver gray, not warm brown, and they carried something in them that the other man did not. Wait, the kind that accumulates over years of making decisions that cost something. He was looking at her with an expression she could not name, not cold exactly, not warm, something in between that felt more dangerous than either. His voice was quiet. It should not have carried over the noise of the festival, but it did. It went directly into her ear like he had spoken it there on purpose. You keep choosing the wrong brother. Elara went completely still. She turned slowly, back toward where the first man had been standing. Lorenzo was already gone, and on his face, in the last half-second before he disappeared into the crowd, she caught something she had not seen there during their entire warm and easy conversation. A smile, thin and satisfied and entirely too knowing. And she understood, standing in the middle of the moon festival with the bonfire throwing gold light across the face of the Alpha King, that the night she had borrowed for herself had just become something else entirely, something she had not chosen and could not return. She had wanted one night of being real. It appeared she had gotten exactly that. He did not ask her name. That was the first thing she noticed. Every man she had ever spoken to, high-ranking wolf or common trader, had led with that. What is your name? Where are you from? Who do you belong to? It was the way this world sorted people, slotted them into their proper place in the hierarchy so everyone knew exactly how much attention to pay them. Matteo did not ask. He simply looked at her for one long, measuring moment, then turned and walked, and somehow she understood without being told that she was supposed to follow. She did not know why she did. She told herself it was because his hand was still loosely at her elbow, not gripping, not forcing, just present in a way that left her very little room to argue. But that was not entirely honest. The truth was that the look on Lorenzo's face as he disappeared into the crowd had shaken something loose inside her chest, and she needed to understand what she had just stepped into before she could think about stepping out of it. Matteo led her away from the bonfire, away from the music and the lanterns and the warm press of the festival crowd, through a narrow corridor between two stone buildings that opened onto a quieter courtyard behind the main square. The noise of the festival did not disappear here, but it softened, became something in the distance, like music heard through a closed door. He stopped in the center of the courtyard and turned to face her. Up close, in the quieter light of a single torch mounted to the stone wall, she could see him more clearly than she had in the chaotic glow of the bonfire. The silver gray of his eyes was striking, almost unnatural, and there were fine lines at their corners that had not come from laughing. His jaw was tight in the way of a man who had been holding tension in his body for so long he no longer noticed it. He was younger than the stories made him sound. She had expected someone who felt ancient and untouchable. Instead, he felt like someone who was very tired and very careful about letting it show. He studied her with the same frankness she imagined he used to study everything. No pretense in it, no performance, just assessment. You are not nobility, he said. It was not a question. It was not an insult either, just an observation stated plainly. No, she said. She matched his tone because she refused to be made smaller than she already was in this moment. I am a weaver from the weaver's quarter. I have no rank, no wolf, and no idea what is happening right now. Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, more like a door opening 1 inch. How long were you speaking with him? He asked. Long enough to embarrass myself, apparently. I am not asking about your embarrassment. I am asking how long and whether he touched you at any point, skin to skin. The specificity of the question made the back of her neck prickle. He shook my hand when we introduced ourselves. Why does that matter? Matteo turned away from her and pressed one fist briefly against his mouth, and she got the sense she was watching someone absorb information they had been hoping not to receive. When he turned back, His expression had closed again, settled back into that careful neutrality. "His name is Lorenzo," he said. "He is my younger brother, and he is many things, but careless is not one of them. If he spoke to you tonight, it was because he chose you specifically. And if he chose you specifically, it was because of what you are." Ilara stared at him. "I am a weaver." "No," Matteo said, and the quiet certainty in his voice stopped her cold. "That is what you do with your hands. It is not what you are." She wanted to argue. She had spent 23 years being exactly what she said she was and nothing more. She had the thread-stained fingers and the aching back and the small workshop with its cracked window to prove it. She was not someone with a hidden identity or a secret bloodline, or whatever it was that the silver-eyed king standing across from her was implying. She opened her mouth to say exactly that. Then the blade came. She did not see where it came from. One moment the courtyard was still and quiet, and the next there was a sound like the air itself being cut open, and something silver and fast was moving directly toward her from the left. Her body reacted before her mind did, and what happened next was not a decision. It was not a choice. It simply happened. Her right hand came up, and the threads came with it. She felt them the way you feel your own heartbeat, something that had always been there that she had simply never had a reason to notice before. They came from her palm outward, invisible to her own eyes but absolute in her body, and they hit the blade mid-flight and the blade stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Hung in the air 3 feet from her face, trembling like a plucked string on a bow, and then it came apart. Not broke, not fell, came apart, thread by thread, molecule by molecule, until there was nothing left of it but a faint shimmer in the air that dissolved in seconds. The courtyard was completely silent. Ilara stood with her hands still raised and her whole body shaking in a way she could not control, and she did not fully understand what she had just done. She looked at her palm like it belonged to someone else. The skin was faintly warm. Nothing else had changed, but something in the air around her had shifted, something she could feel but not name. She lowered her hand slowly. When she looked up, Matteo was watching her with an expression that cracked her open a little, because she recognized it. She had seen it in her own mirror on the morning she finished that blue and gold panel and understood for the first time just how good it was. Recognition. The particular terror of encountering something you had believed was a story, and discovering it is standing in front of you made entirely of flesh and breath. He was afraid of her, not in a way that made him step back, in a way that made him absolutely still. "It is you," he said, barely above a whisper. "What is me?" Her voice cracked on the last word. She did not apologize for it. He exhaled, long and slow and careful, the breath of someone who has been bracing for news and finally received it. Then he did something she had not expected from the Alpha King of Valor. He sat down on the low stone ledge at the edge of the courtyard, put his elbows on his knees, and pressed his hands together in front of him like a man in a church who needs a moment to collect himself. "There is a prophecy," he began, "that is older than the obsidian pack, older than the throne, older than any law written in this kingdom. It describes a woman born without a wolf but with the ability to weave reality itself. Not cloth, not thread, reality. She is called the Sun-Touched, and she exists for one specific purpose." He paused. "To tether the Alpha King's wolf before it destroys him." Ilara sat down too, not because she was calm, because her legs had made the decision for her. "Destroys him," she repeated. "My wolf is not stable," he said, and the flatness in his voice told her how long he had been carrying that sentence alone. "It has not been stable for 3 years. The power that comes with the alpha bloodline is not a clean thing. It is loud and it is violent. And it requires constant management that I am running out of the ability to provide. Without a tether, the wolf will eventually override everything else. The man disappears. What is left is something no kingdom can survive being ruled by." The festival music drifted faintly over the courtyard walls. A child laughed somewhere in the distance. Ilara sat in the middle of all that ordinary life and tried to make room in her mind for what he was telling her. "You said Lorenzo chose me specifically," she said slowly, working through it out loud. He already knew what I was." Matteo said nothing, which was its own answer. "He brought me to the festival. The pieces were assembling themselves in an order she did not want. He was warm and funny, and he asked me the right questions, and I felt like I was actually being seen, and the entire time he was using me." She heard her own voice go quiet on that last part, not dramatic, just quiet, the way a candle goes out when the air leaves the room. Why? What did he want? Footsteps in the corridor entrance behind her. She turned. Lorenzo stood at the mouth of the courtyard with his hands loose at his sides and that same fine, calculated smile on his face that she had caught in the last second before he vanished into the crowd. Up close, in the torchlight, without the warmth she had projected onto him, she could see what she had missed. The smile never quite reached the dark of his eyes. It lived only in the lower half of his face, practiced and perfect and empty at the center. "You were bait," he said, and his voice was pleasant about it, which was somehow worse than if it had been cold. "The Covenant of Shadows has been watching this court for months, waiting for proof that the Sun-Touched exists. I needed them to send an assassin. I needed that assassin to move on you in a public enough setting that your power would be witnessed and confirmed. You did exactly what I needed you to do, and nobody got seriously hurt, so I think on balance it was a reasonable plan." Ilara looked at him for a long moment. "You shook my hand," she said. "You were kind to me. You asked what my favorite thing to make was." Something moved across his face then, brief and real, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. Not guilt exactly. More like the faint, uncomfortable awareness that a person has when they understand they have done something they cannot entirely defend. It disappeared as quickly as it came. "You were never in real danger," he said. "I knew what you were capable of before you did." "That is not the point." He had nothing to say to that. She stood up from the stone ledge, and she did not look at Lorenzo again. She looked at Matteo, who had risen when his brother entered and was watching her now with that same careful, heavy expression, waiting for whatever she was going to do next. She was angry. She was shaken. Her hand was still faintly warm, and she still did not fully understand what had come out of it an hour ago, and she was standing in a courtyard behind the moon festival with a king and a traitor, and a prophecy she had never asked for, and the whole night felt like it had been written by someone else and handed to her without warning. But underneath all of that, she felt something she could not quite dismiss. She had stopped a blade, without thinking, without training, without even understanding what she was doing. She had reached out and unmade something that was going to harm her, and she had done it the same way she reached for thread, instinctively, as naturally as breathing. 23 years of invisible. 23 years of making herself small enough that nobody would look twice. And it turned out she had been carrying something extraordinary in her hands the entire time, without ever knowing it was there. Matteo's voice was quiet when he spoke, and it held none of the command she had expected from him. It held something closer to honesty. "You can hate me for this later," he said. "Both of us. You have every right to. But right now I need you to understand what tonight has set in motion, because you are not safe until you do. And I need you to let me explain what you are." Ilara looked at her hand one more time. Then she lifted her eyes to his and said nothing, because she did not have the words yet. But she did not walk away, and they both understood that for now, that was enough. She heard them before she saw them. It started as a low sound, almost beneath hearing, the kind of vibration you feel in your back teeth before your ears catch up. Then it became drums. Not festival drums, not the warm celebratory beat she had walked toward just days ago with her good dress on and her heart full of something brave. These were war drums, slow and deliberate, the sound of something that had already made up its mind. Ilara stood at the narrow window of the room they had given her inside the spire and looked out at what was gathering beyond the palace gates. There were hundreds of them, dark-clad, organized, moving into position with the quiet efficiency of people who had been planning this for longer than she had known any of their names. The Covenant of Shadows had not come to negotiate. They had come with the certainty of people who believed the outcome was already decided, and watching them spread across the open ground below the spire walls, she understood why they felt that way. They had numbers, they had coordination, and they had the simple, brutal advantage of being willing to burn everything down to get what they wanted. What they wanted was her. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone of the window ledge and tried to breathe evenly. 3 days ago, she had been a weaver. 3 days ago, her biggest concern had been the fraying warp thread on her largest loom, and whether the merchant on the east side of the market would pay fairly for the panel she had just finished. 3 days ago, she had not known what the sun-touched was, had not known that her hands held anything other than the ordinary skill she had spent years developing, had not known that a king's wolf was deteriorating in silence, while a prophecy she had never read waited patiently for her to stumble into it. 3 days was not a long time to become a different person. But here she was. She had spent those 3 days inside the spire with Matteo, and she would not have described the experience as comfortable. He was not a man who made things comfortable. He was precise and often blunt, and he did not soften information to make it easier to receive, which she had initially resented and then slowly began to respect. He told her the truth about everything, the prophecy in its full, unflinching detail. The state of his wolf, how close it was to the edge, what it felt like from the inside when the control slipped even slightly. He told her that accepting the tether, allowing her power to bind with his wolf, would cost him something he could not recover. A portion of the raw alpha power he had used for years to protect the kingdom would quiet permanently, would become something steadier and less lethal. And in that transition, there would be a window, days perhaps, where both of them would be at their most vulnerable. He told her all of it, and then he told her the choice was hers. That had undone her more than anything else, he said. She had expected to be informed, commanded, conscripted into this the way she had been conscripted into every other role she had ever filled in this city. Instead, he had laid every card face up on the table, including the ones that made him look fragile, and he had stepped back. She had thought about Lorenzo during those 3 days too. She had not wanted to, but the mind does not take requests. She kept returning to the moment in the courtyard when she had said the point was not whether she had been in real danger, and he had gone quiet, and she had seen that flicker of something human move across his face before he locked it away again. She was still angry. She expected she would be angry about it for a long time. But she also understood, in the way you understand things you would rather not, that Lorenzo's plan had worked. The Covenant had sent the assassin. Her power had surfaced, and now both sides knew exactly what she was, which meant the question of whether to step into this had stopped being theoretical. The drums outside grew louder. She heard footsteps in the corridor, unhurried and even, and then Matteo was at the door. He was not wearing ceremonial armor, just dark clothing, practical and unadorned, and his crown, the simple iron circlet she had seen him wear every day in the spire because he refused to set it aside even informally. He looked at her at the window, and then he looked past her at what was assembled below. And his jaw tightened in the way she had come to recognize as him, absorbing something difficult, without letting it become visible on the rest of his face. "They are asking for a response," he said. "What kind of response?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it plainly, the way he said everything. "They want you surrendered to the Covenant, or they want the crown surrendered to their chosen successor. Those are the two options they have presented." Elara turned from the window. "And what is your answer?" He looked at her steadily. "I already gave it." She knew before she asked. Something in the set of his face and the particular stillness of him told her, but she asked anyway. "What did you do?" "I sent the crown down," he said. 30 minutes ago. I placed it on the front steps myself." The room felt suddenly, very quiet despite the drums. "Mateo, you are not a bargaining piece," he said, and his voice was the flattest she had ever heard it, which meant he had gone somewhere past emotion into pure decision. "You are not something I hand over to buy myself more time on a throne. That was never a choice I was willing to make." She stared at him. This man who 3 days ago had been a stranger with silver eyes and a cold hand on her shoulder. This man who had told her the truth about everything, including the parts that cost him, who had given her the choice when he could have simply taken it away, who had just surrendered the crown of valor rather than hand her to the people who wanted to erase her from existence. She thought about the loom back in her workshop. She thought about 23 years of making herself small. She thought about the way her hand had come up in that courtyard, certain and instinctive, as if it had always known what it was supposed to do and had simply been waiting for her to stop being afraid long enough to let it. She thought about the blue and gold panel she had wept over when she sold it, because she had not wanted to let something that beautiful out of her hands. She was so tired of letting things go out of fear. "I need to go outside," she said. Mateo looked at her. "Ilara." "I am not asking permission," she said. "I am telling you what is about to happen." Something moved through his expression then, not the controlled assessment she had grown used to. Something rawer than that, something that had not had time to be managed before it surfaced. He nodded once. She walked out of the room and down the corridor and through the great hall of the spire, and out through the heavy iron doors onto the front steps, and the cold evening air hit her face immediately, sharp and clean, and below her, spread across the open ground between the palace walls, the covenant of shadows went very still. His crown was sitting on the third step down from where she stood, the iron catching the last of the evening light. She looked at the assembled force below her, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was standing inside. The fear was there. She did not pretend it was not. Her hands were shaking faintly at her sides and her heart was going fast, and she was 23 years old and had been a ghost for most of them, and this was the furthest thing possible from invisible. But underneath the fear was something else, something that had been there her whole life. She understood now, woven so deeply into her that she had mistaken it for ordinary. It was the same thing that drove her hands across the loom in the dark before sunrise, the same thing that had made her weep over a finished panel, because she felt the beauty of what she had made, the same thing that had carried her out of her small apartment and into the moon festival in her best dress with her chin lifted, because some part of her had refused, finally, to stay hidden. She raised both hands. The threads came the way they always came now, easier each time, as natural as breath. She felt them extending outward from her palms, invisible to her own eyes but absolute in her body, spreading across the open ground below like light through water. She was not reaching for the Covenant's weapons. She was reaching for something underneath their weapons, the thing beneath the blade, beneath the coordination and the dark clothing and the drums. She was reaching for the human thing, the frightened thing, the thing that had been coerced or convinced or simply never offered another way. She felt it when she found it. Thread by thread, the hold the Covenant had on its own members, the invisible architecture of control and fear they had built inside each person standing on that ground, began to loosen. Not violently, not with force. The way a knot loosens when you find the right thread and pull gently and steadily until the whole thing releases. Wolves at the edges of the formation dropped to their knees first, then more, a ripple moving inward from the outside, slow and unstoppable. She felt Mateo beside her before she heard him. He had come out through the iron doors and was standing one step behind her and slightly to her left, and she felt his wolf the same way she felt the threads, a massive, turbulent presence that had been straining against its own edges for years, loud and exhausted and desperate for something to hold on to. She did not make a decision. She simply extended what she was already doing and let it include him. The wolf went quiet. Not gone, not diminished. Quiet, the way a river goes quiet when it finds the right channel, when it stops fighting the banks and moves the way it was meant to move. She felt Mateo exhale beside her, a long, deep, shuddering breath that he had probably been waiting 3 years to take, and it cost her something to feel that, some composure she had been carefully maintaining, because that breath was the sound of a person who had been holding something unbearable alone for so long they had stopped believing it would ever be set down. The last of the Covenant's formation broke. Leaders scattered. Those who remained stood on the open ground looking at each other, and at the spire steps like people waking up in a place they do not fully remember choosing to walk to. The drums stopped. The silence that followed was enormous. Alara lowered her hands slowly. Her whole body ached with the particular deep tiredness of having used something real, not physical effort, but something deeper, the kind of tired that lives in the chest and the bones. She stood in it and breathed and let the evening air move across her face. She heard Mateo step down beside her. She turned and found him closer than she expected, and she saw that the tightness that had lived around his eyes for every moment she had known him was gone. Not all of it, not the kind of gone that means it never comes back, but gone enough that she could see what was underneath it. And what was underneath it was a face that was younger than the weight he carried and steadier than she had expected, and looking at her like she had done something he had believed for 3 years was impossible. His crown was still on the step below them. He reached down and picked it up, held it for a moment looking at it in his hands. Then he looked at her. She did not reach for it. That was not what this was. She was not a queen in this moment, and she was not a trophy, and she was not the sun-touched of a prophecy older than anyone standing in this courtyard. She was Alara Voss, weaver, 23 years old, thread-stained hands and all, and she had just stitched something back together that had been unraveling for a very long time. She met his eyes and held them, and she did not look away, and neither did he. She had spent 23 years weaving cloth, warp and weft, thread over thread, building something strong and whole from individual strands that meant nothing alone. She understood now, standing on the steps of the spire with the evening settling around them and the wolves in the courtyard slowly finding their way back to themselves, that she had been practicing for this her entire life. Not to be a weapon, not to be a symbol or a myth or a piece in someone else's game. To be the person who knew how to find the broken threads and pull them, gently and without flinching, back into something that could hold. She had wanted one night of being real. She had gotten something she did not have a word for yet, something larger and more frightening and more hers than anything she had ever made on a loom. She thought she might be all right with that. She thought, looking at the man beside her and the steady quiet that had replaced the thunder in him, that she might be more than all right.